welcome a panel of benefits experts, and this is where we'll do the deep dive into the federal space, because we all know the federal government has to be different, and they are indeed. So I would like to welcome our panel. Tom is going to introduce the full panel, but I'm going to introduce Tom. Tom Temin is, you probably heard him on the radio. He's an amazing presence here in the DC area. We're thrilled to have you here doing this. Tom is moderating our panel Federal Experts this morning, radio personality at Federal News Network. He's hosted the Federal Drive for over a decade and has been reporting for more than 30 years, having served as editor-in-chief of Government Computer News and Washington Technology magazines. Have you been doing Federal Drive over a decade?
12 years, actually.
Wow. Time flies. He also contributes a regular column on government information technology, well-known name in government. Tom, we're honored to have you here and hosting our panel. Please welcome Tom Temin.
Thank you, sir. Well, good morning, and there's no excuse if you don't have a radio in your car or you're not home in the kitchen with the radio, because it's on podcast, and we've had 1.5 million downloads. So if you don't listen to the Federal Drive, you got to get with the program. But I want to thank Shane for having me here to do this panel this morning. Always good to work with the great folks at WAEPA, and also to Amanda for all her support in getting this panel together and making sure we're all on the straight and narrow. And with respect to what Tiffany said, I only want to say here's my piece of credit card advice. If in your lifetime you have ever had a Sears credit card, chances are you still do. I know they're bankrupt. I haven't set foot in Sears in probably 35 years, but the last time I did, it had been 20 years since the time before that, and I still had a credit card account. So some things never die. I think Sears credit cards have about the half-life of uranium. Anyway, this is the final event that I have in 3 days of traveling around the northeast part of the country. I went to my alma mater, Rochester Institute of Technology, for homecoming this past weekend, and got to talk to a lot of students, people interested actually in federal service, either directly for the government or for working for one of the contractors, but starting out in life. And I said, well, start saving, whatever you do. And then I was at the Executive Leadership Conference in IT, a federal IT conference, 1,000 people, and a lot of mid-career people there, a lot of post-retiree second career people there. And then today, WAEPA. So it's Rochester, Philadelphia, and DC. And I would not rather be in Philadelphia. And so I've talked to a lot of people, and the thread, of course, is making a living, maintaining a living, and preparing for the future. So this is a perfect way to end some days of travel. And I'm at the stage in life, this appeals to me too, I'm starting to get those unsolicited 800 calls from Medicare providers. I said, well, if you know I'm going to be 65, you know what my address is, so just send paperwork, please, and don't bother me on the phone. Anyhow, we have a great panel that's going to talk about federal pay, benefit, all the issues. We're going to talk about pretty much anything you want to talk about, but flexible spending accounts, open season, and all these things are coming. To my immediate left is Kowalik. She's the founder of ProFeds. She's a federal retirement expert, and has appeared in many media, and we're going to try to get her on Federal News Radio, perhaps, pretty soon. Also a former active duty U.S. Marine, so don't mess with her. Chris, great to have you on the panel.
Thank you.
To Chris's left is Nicole Ogrysko, my colleague, one of our top reporters at Federal News Network. I'm going to embarrass Nicole a little bit, because in 42 years of journalism, including about 30 years in editorial management, Nicole is one of the sharpest I've ever seen. And so she really knows what's going on inside federal heads and what's going on in the federal jobs and pay and benefits market. So she's a great person to have on the panel. Nicole, good to have you.
Thank you.
And to Nicole's left is Brian Kurrus. He's something with a CFR with a trademark symbol under it, but he's loaded with certifications. He's a financial advisor, certified financial planner, Signature Financial Partners in Tyson's Corner for a long time. And if it has to do with investments and optimizing your long-term prospects, he's your guy. So that's our panel today. And our format's very simple. I've got a lot of questions. If you want to go till 2, 3 in the afternoon, I've got it. So, but we won't make it go that long. And I also want to say it's great to have an audience where there are people in the front row, because very often from this vantage point, it looks like the chapel on a cruise ship. Is there anybody here, besides me? So really good to have you all in the front row. But what we're going to do is start with some generalized questions about the state of affairs and how they affect federal financially. And there's lots of states of federal affairs going on right now. In fact, it's kind of hard to listen to some of the general purpose radio. And then we'll get into the specifics. Open season is pretty soon. People are thinking about what they're going to do on healthcare front and TSP. There's a lot of change there. So we'll talk about all those things, and we'll have plenty of time for your questions also. So I'm going to throw out kind of a warm-up question to set the scene for us, and all the panelists can answer this one. And as we are headed into, I think there's a new extension of the continuing resolution, and Nicole and I were talking about this beforehand, with what is preoccupying Congress. There's the possibility that there could be either a year-long CR, which means you'd get no pay raise, even though everyone says that you should, or the dreaded shutdown could conceivably occur. So what are some lessons learned from the past experience in really long CRs, or, as we had last year, the longest shutdown ever?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, first off, we need to have an emergency fund, also referred to as a noodle plan. This, certainly comes to be in any shutdown. We want at least 3 months, ideally 6 months. When you're dealing with a potential government shutdown, I think we definitely want to pad that emergency fund more than 3 months if possible. We don't want to have to be charging up on high interest credit cards. We don't want to have to be tapping into our TSP and taking a financial hardship withdrawal and paying taxes and penalties. So it's certainly important, even more important than your average individual, to make sure that we're prepared with money in non-retirement savings so that we have something we can turn to in the event of a shutdown.
And I would just say that I think, from my perspective, I think we saw a lot of agencies, federal employees scrambling, quite frankly, to answer questions that maybe they never encountered before, even based on previous shutdowns, sequestration, furloughs, et cetera. We saw the Office of Personnel Management, I think, have to answer questions that they had never encountered before just because of the length of the shutdown. And so there were a lot of unknowns, and I think federal employees, the workforce, Office of Personnel Management included, learned from the shutdown, and I think it's something that we would like to not have to repeat again.
But chances are we will. I certainly will echo Brian and Nicole here. Cash is king when it comes to your financial security. If you do not have cash in the bank to be able to step in when things like a shutdown happen, you are going to scramble, and it's going to be painful. Certainly very grateful to Shane and the folks at WAEPA to hear that they waived premiums during that time. A big round of applause for them for doing that. But I will share with you that most other companies don't do that. Your electric company didn't say, hey, you don't have to pay this month. Neither did your car company, your automobile insurance company, your homeowner's insurance company. None of those places care. They want to be paid. And so you've got to have the money to be able to step up and do that. And one final thought, I always try to be very candid with employees who are preparing for retirement, because I think being very direct helps people to get the information that they need. If you were affected by this shutdown and your whole life fell apart because you didn't have cash in the bank, you're not ready to retire. Okay, and we've got to make sure that we've got all those pieces in place so that it feels good stepping into retirement, and you're doing so from a real place of financial confidence, and not just because you're done working and tired of going to work every day.
Well, the only thing worse than death is outliving your money, at least what I've heard.
Amen.
And just a quick follow-up question, and I hear this, and that's why I ask. I'm hearing more and more people keeping a wad of physical cash in the house because they're worried that cybersecurity could shut down the ATM network in the event. Is that wise, or yes, no, do it or not do it?
It's not a bad idea. Hopefully there's not too big of a risk of something like that happening, but in some ways you're just diversifying for those worst case scenarios. So whether that be a month of living expenses or something along those lines, it doesn't hurt to have something immediately available if one of those kind of worst case scenarios did occur, so that you're covered when other people may not be.
All right, just don't try to store it in a waterbed, that's all. They still have water beds? I don't know. Nowadays they blow up with, you go like this and up and down. All right. Well, let me broaden the question to generally, what are the kinds of questions you're hearing feds ask about the conditions, their financial outlook, and so on? You can go right down the line.
Yeah, Tom, like you mentioned, so many employees are worried about running out of money. And specifically in retirement, once you step into retirement, do you have the funds available to live the life that you want? Like Tiffany mentioned earlier, when you step into retirement, you shouldn't be reducing your standard of living. You should be maintaining it, and keep in mind you have 8 extra hours a day to spend money in retirement that you're not going to work, and so you want to make sure to have that buffer. But by and large, the theme that we see across all federal employees is they're worried about running out of money and not having the money that they really need to live the life that they've imagined in retirement. So I hope that you'll take that to heart and everything that Tiffany shared with you, and make sure that you're providing that padding in your savings as well, for sure.
So from my perspective, the big theme, the big unanswered question is, what will a pay raise look like next year? And I think we're seeing two different things, two potential different paths. The White House has, in fact, the president has, in fact, suggested that he would raise pay for federal employees in 2020. The number from the White House proposal is 2.6%. The House, however, has a proposal that offers a 3.1% pay raise on average for most federal employees in 2020. So the big question now is, which number will it be? I think federal employees will likely see some sort of raise next year. It's just that question of, what will the number be? When will it come? Will it be impacted by a shutdown? I don't think that that's actually likely, given the fact that the White House has made its own proposal. So the big thing that we're watching at Federal News Network is the pay raise.
And one of the common themes I'm coming across is the TSP Modernization Act, which we just had in September 15th, that launched. And I think we'll be getting into some of the specifics here, but essentially that's given us a lot more withdrawal options. So that used to be one of the biggest downsides within the TSP, is that we were a little limited how and when we could pull money out. Unfortunately, those have certainly changed for the better. Along with that, when I'm dealing with retirement planning, one of the big questions I'll get is, what should I be doing with my TSP? I've got an option to move it at 59.5 if I'm still working, and then once I retire or separate from service, should I be moving my TSP over to an IRA? Should I be taking my old 401k and moving that into the thrift savings plan? And at the end of the day, that's going to really come down to our investment options. So I want to review within those TSP funds how happy I am with the options, what the fees look like, which are fortunately very low, and then compare that to what I would have outside of it. And there's not a right or wrong answer. It really just comes down to a preference in terms of how I want to be managing those retirement assets.
Well, this might be a good place to delve into the TSP. And maybe if you would, Brian, just give us a quick rundown on what modernization has changed for the TSP. Anyone not know what the TSP is? It's not too late. You don't have to raise your hand, but.
So the TSP Modernization Act, it essentially increased our withdrawal options. So we used to only be able to go in if we wanted to pull money out, $20,000 for a new car, medical bills, whatever it may be. We could go in and do that once in our entire lifetime. And other than that, everything had to be on a set withdrawal schedule, either X amount per month. We could only change it once a year at the end of the year, or we have to set it up based on our life expectancy, but we didn't have a lot of flexibility with it. So that TSP Modernization Act has essentially removed those barriers. It's allowed us to pull money out however we want. If we have our traditional TSP and the Roth, we want to choose which basket it's going to be coming out of. Then we have the ability to do so, rather than just being limited to it being proportional. So there's been a lot of increased withdrawal options and flexibility as a result.
And Nicole, what are some of the questions you've been getting? Because Nicole has covered the details of the withdrawal options in detail.
One of the big questions that we got was whether or not TSP participants would be able to specify what specific funds they could withdraw money from, and the answer to that is this is not something that you can do under this new TSP Modernization Act that Brian mentioned. What you can do is specify how often you get these payments, what the amount is, et cetera. We're also hearing that I think generally most federal employees were curious and maybe they didn't quite even understand their previous options before these new withdrawal options came in place. And so there were just simply a lot of questions about what this would mean, what forms they might need to fill out online to make some of these changes, et cetera. And I know that the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which was hard at work putting these changes in place, they reported within the first 24 hours that 93 to 9,400 people initiated or finished some sort of new withdrawal request within the first 24 hours that these options were available. So it was clear that people wanted this change, and I think those numbers are going to increase only more.
Wow, Chris, any comment on that? Yeah, because it sounds like a complicated set of decisions.
It's certainly complicated, and the challenge with the TSP and any of these withdrawal options is you have to make sure that you understand the consequences of the options that you're making. Just because it's on the list of the things that the TSP will allow you to do doesn't mean it's always in your financial best interest to do so. So while we have expanded withdrawal options, which are great, we also fear from the financial services industry perspective that more federal employees will dip into the account that was designed for your retirement years. And so at the end, you end up having a lesser dollar amount to be able to plan for. And of course, that adds another layer of problems on top of the challenge of just the complexity of the TSP. There's one final thing that I want to mention specifically on the TSP, and that is your beneficiary designations. So Tiffany had mentioned how important it was to attach beneficiaries to bank accounts, but 95% of the TSP statements that we see here at ProFeds don't have a beneficiary assigned. Please update those. It's TSP3, it's an easy form. There's a number of other beneficiary forms as well, but certainly with TSP, you've worked so hard and so long for your whole career to build up that money. You want to make sure it goes to the right person.
My question was, it doesn't have to be a family member, and does it necessarily have to be a person?
Great question. It doesn't. You can name anybody that you wish. If you run out of people that you like, you can give your money to a church or a charity or a cause. So lots of different options that you have. Like Tiffany had mentioned, a trust. A trust can be a beneficiary on your TSP account. So lots of different options out there.
And just, I know it's, probably everyone does know this, but just to be specific and not to leave it unturned, it can be a significant other that is not a spouse, not a legal spouse.
Absolutely. You can name anybody that you wish.
Okay, good. Anything else about year-end? Does anything year-end have to apply to TSP? I mean, is it a good time to think about your options and investment
So
balance?
one of the things that I'll look at year-end is to try to make sure that we're putting at least 5% into our TSP. If we're a FERS participant, we can get matched on that first 5%. What I really don't want to do is be maxing that out too soon. If I am maxing out, that's great. But if I'm doing it in the first 3 quarters of the year, I'm only getting matched on that first 5% that I put in each paycheck. So those last few paychecks, I'm not putting any money in. I'm still getting my automatic 1%, but I'm now missing out on the other 4%. So there is a calculator online on tsp.gov. You can go in, plug in how much you've put in so far, how many pay periods are left. It'll help do the math for you to make sure that I'm hitting that max, but I'm not hitting it too soon. And that way I'm not missing out on any of that matching money.
And just a quick follow-up on the Roth option, which for many decades, I think most average people figured it was not for them because the implication was that it was only worthwhile if you thought your income would rise after retirement. But in many cases, and I just saw a conference full of former feds peddling for contractors now, and their incomes definitely went up. So is that the only circumstance for a Roth, or maybe not?
We see the Roth option as really an amazing planning tool because you're essentially allowing all of the growth to come to you tax-free in retirement. Either way, whether you go traditional or Roth, you're going to pay tax on the principal. That's the money that you're putting into the account. The question you need to ask yourself to determine whether the Roth is a really great option for you is, do you want to be taxed on the growth on the account? And if the answer is no, then Roth is really an amazing option for you. The Roth only came out in 2012. A lot of federal employees have never really understood how they worked. You like the immediate tax opportunity that you have to not pay tax today, which is the traditional TSP. But when you're really looking for that long-term impact, looking at an account like the Roth TSP or in the private sector, a Roth IRA will allow you to have that tax-free growth that so many folks are looking for. There's only 2 reasons in retirement that you're going to be in a lower tax bracket. One is because you don't have enough money to live the lifestyle that you were hoping for, or 2, because you didn't plan to be in a lower tax bracket with accounts like the Roth that allow you to have tax-free income and, of course, pay less tax in retirement than you do right now.
That's definitely one of the biggest questions that I'll get is, which one's better? Should I be putting it into the Roth side or not? For anyone who's not familiar, when we use the traditional TSP, we're not paying any taxes on that money going in. So that's pre-tax, going to grow and accumulate tax deferred, and then all distributions are going to be taxed as ordinary income. When we're putting money into the Roth side, then we're paying taxes on that contribution today, but we then have the benefit, as Chris was talking about, where that's tax deferred growth and can be pulled out tax-free in retirement. So I do want to look at my tax bracket now. I want to try to estimate what that may be in retirement. If I am in my prime earning years and I do think that I'm going to have a significant income drop, that would be a reason to stick with the traditional TSP. But as was mentioned, a lot of us don't wind up changing. We might see our salary drop, but we still have our FERS annuity, Social Security. Then we start taking withdrawals from retirement plans, and we may wind up in that same tax bracket after all. A couple other things to think about as well is we don't know for sure where tax brackets may go. What are they going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now? If we wound up having higher tax brackets, that would certainly benefit us to have some money on the Roth side. Also, our required minimum distributions, where when we have money within the TSP, we will have required minimum distributions where the IRS forces us to start taking money out even if we don't need to at 70.5. We're going to have that regardless of how that's set up. If we were to move that Roth TSP to a Roth IRA, that could give us some more flexibility in terms of avoiding those required minimum distributions. So there's potentially more down the line tax breaks for that Roth money, and that will sometimes factor in at the beginning to where we're putting those contributions in the first place. The only thing that isn't impacted is that matching contribution. Does not matter if we're putting our money in the traditional or the Roth side. Any matching funds that we're going to get will always go into the taxable account, so that doesn't impact our decision. But most of us have the majority, if not all, of our funds in the traditional TSP. So it certainly helps to consider the Roth side to give us this other tax-free bucket that we could potentially use later on.
Right. And Tom, end of year, one more thing I want to make sure to add for the audience is if you're to a point that you're maxing out your thrift savings plan and you're in the year in which you're turning 50, you have that catch-up contribution available to you that allows you to put even above and beyond the normal IRS limit. You must re-elect that every year. If you want to continue to contribute to the catch-up contribution piece of the TSP, it's not something that just naturally continues into the following year. So you need to make sure to go back in and re-elect that so that those contributions continue.
All right, and if you can arrange to inherit $10 million, that's my advice. What do they say about maybe give grandma the pill? I don't know. Just kidding. All right.
Ouch.
Now that we've done covering the simple topics, let's talk about something a little bit more complicated, and that is healthcare. Healthcare options. Open season is nearly upon us for the different federal healthcare plans. Let's start with best advice. Let's start with Nicole here. What you cover this also, and what are people asking, and what are some of the trends you've seen?
Well, I think the big thing is we consistently hear year after year about 5 to 6% of participants in the federal employee health benefits plan actually change their plan on any given year. And OPM estimates that really about 20 to 30% more actually could change a plan during any given year. Often you can find new savings that maybe you didn't have previously. I mean, the big questions that we get year after year are, what are the premium rate increases and when do we find out about them? And that information has come out. So in 2020, federal employees on average will pay about 5.6% more toward their premiums. Again, that is an average. It depends on what plan you're in, if it's self, family, self plus one. The government will contribute 3.2%, and overall, if you bring all that together, it's about a 4% bump over the previous year. If you think about what you paid last year, it's a little bit more. Premiums only went up about 1.5% or so for the average federal employee, so this is a big jump, I think, and not many were thrilled.
Definitely.
Yeah, so, sure.
Certainly, when it comes to those health insurance premiums, while you're working, those are important. They're also really important when you're retired, because you're going to now pay those health insurance premiums with money you've already been taxed on. Right now, most federal employees don't pay tax on the money that they use to pay their FEHB premium. It's called premium conversion. But once you step into retirement, you have an immediate tax increase, because anything you pay towards your Blue Cross Blue Shield or your Aetna or Kaiser or whatever FEHB plan you have is now going to be taxable to you. And so it's going to feel more expensive, even though the premium itself might have stayed the same. It will feel more expensive as a retiree, for sure.
Okay, I just, apropos of nothing, I heard a really interesting podcast on satellite, listening to NPR somewhere in upstate New York, and it said one of the most important things, it's called the brain, what's it called, the brain? The brain is in the word. It's a really excellent podcast, an hour-long show. And the thesis there was that one of the most important things to maintaining your physical health is to maintain your emotional health through friendships and connections with people. And there's a lot of evidence, clinical evidence, that shows that that kind of emotional connection and having a network of people that you can connect with can have as much positive effect on your health later in life as eating oatmeal and walking the dog around the block and that kind of thing. So whatever it's worth. If you know someone that might be lonely, reach out, say hi. You know, maybe you could help someone's actual physical health by connecting with them. All right, is there a good place to go with all of the options? I mean, it's a wonderful bouquet of choices that federal employees have for healthcare options, but it's also a complicated choice because there are so many options and they all have different nuances depending on your health, your state of life, your gender, whatever it might be. What's the best place to go for some objective information about comparisons?
I would certainly say opm.gov. If you go there, they have a great FEHB comparison tool that allows you to pick all the different plans that you're thinking about. Maybe you've got a friend of yours that is in another state and they said this particular program's worked really well for them. You can see what it looks like in your area, be able to compare all those plans. It'll show you side-by-side comparisons of deductibles, out-of-pocket expenses, in-network provider, out-of-network provider, all of those pieces. So really a great tool to be able to help you make sure you're making the right decision.
Yeah, I would second the opm.gov suggestion. Often readers will reach out to us, and we love to get your questions, but we are not the best people to recommend which health plan you should shop for next year. One other thing I would add, though, about this particular upcoming open season is there will actually be a few more new plan options this year for the first time. There will be 2 new, what's called an indemnity plan. It's similar to a fee-for-service plan, and it'll be offered by the Government Employees Health Association. That's new. It's not something that OPM has offered in a few decades at least. And in general, there will be 14 more new FEHB plan options this year. So, more options, more things to shop around and look for.
Okay. We have a few more minutes to go before we get to your questions, if I understood the sign that's facing me. Okay. This is a well-organized group, and I can tell that this panel is really connecting, because I do a lot of panels, and I can see the percentage sleeping or the percentage on their phone, and it's almost nobody here. So, I'm trying to take notes too, because it's just absolutely golden advice But let's just talk about the beginning of a career. Maybe not everyone here is early in their career, but maybe you know someone earlier in your career, and if you like federal employment, and millions really do, you might recommend it to someone young, maybe a child, grandchild. What are some mistakes people make early on that could correct a lot, they could avoid a lot of financial questions later on?
One of the biggest mistakes I'll see is not reviewing the thrift savings plan investment options. Perhaps they just set it up, put it into one of the funds, didn't really look at why they were using it, thought they would come back to it, and next thing we know, it's 10, 12 years down the line, and they just haven't gotten around to it. So you definitely want to make it a priority to make sure you're doing everything right within your thrift savings plan. Am I putting in the right amount as much as I can given my budget? Am I allocating that in the best way possible? Anytime we look at future growth of money, it's the power of compounding. So if I get this money invested, earning as much as possible in year one, that's going to go much further than making sure I'm allocating down the road. I really want to make sure I set things up the right way, and I want to go in each quarter, at least once a year, and review that allocation. Do I need to rebalance it? Should I be making any other changes? And it's definitely worth the time now, because that may wind up making the difference later if I can retire at the date that I want to, versus needing to work another year or 2 years because I didn't get around to it early in my career.
Definitely.
Chris?
I would say, we do retirement workshops throughout the country with federal agencies and out in the private community as well, specifically for federal employees. And there's an overarching comment that we get from folks who attend, and it's, I wish I would have done this 10 or 20 years ago. Had I known then what I know now, I would rewind the clock and do things differently. And so it's never too early to begin the planning process, and I would argue it's never too late as well. And so if you feel like you're behind, we're about ready to enter the year 2020. We know hindsight's 2020, right? We could have made lots of decisions in the past, but taking those steps today to put yourself in a better situation is going to be certainly worth your while.
And I'll just say on the TSP front, the TSP in 2020 next year will actually begin to automatically enroll new participants at 5% starting next year, with the thought that if you do not want to be enrolled at that level, you would have to make a choice and elect that change yourself. So I think the TSP is seeing that it can do its part to just perhaps enroll people automatically at that level, and they can make the changes themselves.
Okay, well, we'll switch to the other end, God willing, maybe not, of life, and that is the long-term care prospects. And having looked at this personally, it's a really expensive long-term care insurance, and like all insurance, if you don't have it when you need it, you're in trouble, but it's a gamble as to whether you'll need it. So what are some thoughts on thinking about that, planning for it, buy it, not buy it, and how do you...
Long-term care, certainly it's not fun to think about. No one wants to need care, but if we ever needed to go into a nursing home or assisted living facility or have an aide come into our home and help us with getting dressed, moving from one room to another, et cetera, that's where we may have a long-term care bill. And it unfortunately becomes one of the biggest risks in retirement of something that we haven't already protected ourselves for. We have our health insurance, our homeowners insurance, our life insurance. What if we have that long-term care bill for $100,000 a year plus? What kind of impact is that going to have to our savings? So with that, we can potentially shift some of that risk to the insurance provider with long-term care. You have a great program through LTC Feds that you can look at. WAEPA offers their life coverage with the chronic illness rider, which will help with that potential long-term care expenses, and then you'll see private insurance plans as well. What I recommend for anyone approaching retirement is to look at the costs and come up with a plan. If you do have the assets available, you want to self-insure, you're comfortable what the impact would be to your estate to pay out of pocket, then that's fine. At least we've addressed it and we have a plan. But for a lot of us, we don't want to take that risk, and we want to look at how we can potentially shift some of that risk away, and considering some type of coverage that's going to cover for those expenses is going to be the best way to address it.
And Tom, I would share with everyone that there are really two reasons why none of you want to buy long-term care insurance. I'm no mind reader, but I know what you're all thinking. It's going to be really expensive, and I'm afraid of paying for a product that I might not ever use. Statistically, you will use it. About 70% of Americans over the age of 65 will have some sort of long-term care event in their life, and without the proper type of coverage, you may put yourself or your family in a situation where you're draining a lot of your assets and leaving perhaps the spouse without the assets that you intended to provide to them. And so it's really important. I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, and I understand, but when we see the planning end or the lack of planning end when it comes to long-term care, I cannot encourage you enough to have a plan. It doesn't have to necessarily be a specific long-term care insurance policy. There's lots of creative options out there, but do something simply because the stats are not in any of our favors.
And what about some of the documents that you might need to have in place? I know in my personal case, we haven't looked at them in 25 years. And with respect to your last wishes, whether you want intensive care, should some life-threatening event occur, your inheritance, your leavings and trusts and all that, when should you review that?
Definitely.
You want to review that before retirement and then ongoingly in retirement. And this goes for retirement planning as well. It's not just something that you do once and then never address it again. You certainly want to go back over time and review our retirement plans, our estate plans, the wills, trusts, and make sure that they're up to date. And also evaluating if we have long-term care coverage. How have costs changed? How has my coverage changed? And where do I stand today? So ideally, I want to do some form of an annual review. It doesn't mean that I need to address everything every year, but I want to look over the basics and see if there's any big changes that I need to make.
Definitely, and I'll share with you that this topic actually hits very close to home for me personally. My father-in-law has been very ill, battling and unfortunately losing a battle with multiple myeloma cancer. And since May 1st, he's been in the hospital or a rehab facility or somewhere. Now he's in hospice at home. And so when he chose to go to hospice, one of the biggest pieces of peace that he had with that decision is he knew he had the assets available for his wife to continue on without him. And that was a huge sense of release. I mean, we talk about that peace of mind, and I think maybe that term gets overused a little bit in the financial services industry, but the peace of mind that he had to be able to make that decision when he was at end of life was so important. Also knowing that all of the documents were in place, the trusts, the wills, the final wishes of how, if he needed medical intervention, significant medical intervention, how that would work. So that really helps families to make decisions along the way when you may not be with it to be able to make those decisions. So I couldn't stress enough how important that process is.
And just a quick question on the reverse of that question. This came up for me personally a few months ago. I was visiting an old friend in Massachusetts, and he's made a lot of money. He's had several businesses, a very complicated kind of structure financially, never married and so on. And he pulled a drawer out in his home office. There's a great big file. He said, when I'm gone, that's where you'll need everything you'll need, because I'm the designated executor. And I have no idea what will happen. I don't really know much detail about his financial life. But if you are an executor, how do you handle that in reality? And can you be compensated from the estate for what can be a very, very time-consuming effort?
You can be. It is very time-consuming, and it's fortunately done by someone that person trusts. So a lot of times they're happy and willing to put in that time and effort to help handle the estate, but it's definitely a time-consuming process. And it certainly helps if you can get some guidelines or basics what their accounts and their financial affairs look like going in. And from there, you take it step by step and figure out how to distribute the assets to their wishes. And if you need to be compensated for your time, then you certainly can arrange that.
Because at the least, you'd probably have to hire competent counsel to be able to navigate something, especially someone who owned businesses or whatever they have.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I just thought I'd throw that one in.
Yeah.